We appreciate all of the guests who have appeared on our show and sincerely thank them for providing you, our audience, with useful information. However, the advice our guests provide is theirs, and we encourage you to seek out a professional if you have specific questions about any topic we cover on the Crushing Debt podcast. On this week's episode of the Crushing Debt podcast, Your Kids, Their Money.
Welcome to the Crushing Debt Podcast with your host, Florida attorney Shawn Yesner, where our goal is to help you get rid of the financial bullies in your life.
So welcome back to this week's episode of the Crushing Debt Podcast. My name is Shawn Yesner, owner and founder of Yesner Law, and I've got George back with me again, remote today. Sorry we don't see you here in the studio, George, but how you doing?
Live from New York, it's your financial coach. How are you, buddy? I got lost on 95 from Tampa, and I made my way up to New York to visit some family. So I just noticed, though, it's a little chilly. It's a little chilly up here.
You go on a search for cheap eggs? Is that what you did?
Not in New York City. That's not going to happen. I think I have to go see a bookie at the end of the block to try and get some enough to go to the grocery store later.
Nice. George and I have an author for you today that I'm really excited to talk to and talk about his books. But before we get there, I want to talk first about one of our two show sponsors. So the first one is Mark Purvis. Mark is our editor, makes us sound good, takes out the ums, takes out the ahs. But he is also an award-winning videographer, and so he has a website called legacyspotlight.com. So again, what we're going to talk about with our guest, kind of preserving stories for future generations, passing stories down to your kids. That's a great market for Mark. He can come out, he can set it up, he gets all his recording equipment, all his video equipment. He'll help you preserve those stories for future generations, or he'll help your past generations record stories for future generations. And again, you can contact him at legacyspotlight.com. But I am excited to introduce our guest today. He is a business consultant with over 2 decades of experience when he left the office to become a full-time stay-at-home dad, something I aspire to be. During this time, he authored his first book, Your Kids, Their Money, which we're going to talk about, which focuses on providing parents with the skills and tools to teach financial literacy to their children. He graduated from Niagara University with a master's degree in business administration. He spent years studying finance and is a passionate advocate for advancing the financial literacy of children and young adults. When not reading or listening to podcasts about finance or economics, and hopefully he adds Crushing Debt to that his list, he can be found fixing up his 100-plus-year-old Toronto home, playing basketball with his kids, chairing a PTA meeting, or DJing in his basement. Our guest this week is Clifton Corbin. Welcome, Clifton.
Thank you, and thank you for that warm introduction. I appreciate it. Yeah,
so I do want to give out your contact information real quick. And again, we'll put all of this in the notes if anybody's curious to connect with him. The website is cliftoncorbin.com, CliftonCorbin. Clifton Corbin, exactly how it's pronounced, cliftoncorbin.com. His email is hello@cliftoncorbin.com. And actually, you're the second person that I've met that has hello at the website as your email address. One other of our previous guests has the word hello as her email, so that's interesting. You can find him on LinkedIn, CD Corbin. You can find him on Instagram, CD Corbin, Twitter, CD Corbin, and Facebook, Clifton D. Corbin. Welcome. How you doing?
I'm doing well, man. Thank you. How you doing?
Good. I think we're excited to talk to you. You know, all three of us, I think, have kids. How old are your kids, Clifton?
Sure. My oldest is he's 10, and my youngest is 8.
Mine are 11 and 8, and George is way ahead of us.
I'm a little way ahead of you guys. I'm 19 and 14. So,
man, you're almost on the other side.
You can like rub my, yeah, I can't wait. I love my kids.
So tell us about. I'm excited to learn about Your Kids, Their Money. So tell us. I know we were talking kind of before the interview. Tell us about how that book came about.
Sure. So it kind of starts with me as a youngster myself. So as a youngster, I was money curious. Like I couldn't learn enough about money. I would, had all those early first jobs, the paper route, the lemonade stand. My dad had an auto shop. He helped me get to investing. I would buy oil wholesale and sell it retail. So like earning money as a youngster was just kind of my thing. I was good at saving. But then I went off to university. I got those early credit cards. didn't know what I was doing, dove deep into debt. I'm sure some of your audience could relate to this. Got all that debt. Felt like truly it was crushing for me. I didn't know what happened. I felt like someone who knew all this or thought I knew a lot about money shouldn't have found himself in this situation. So after I was able to, pay off the debt, get back onto solid footing, started my family, and I was like, well, what happened? How did someone who was so money curious as a youngster, how did I end up with so much debt? How did I end up messing up my finances? And I realized it was because as much as I was interested and curious about money as a youngster, I only knew about earning. I only knew about saving. I didn't know all the rest of the pieces of financial literacy. I didn't understand about wealth creation. I didn't understand how to manage and leverage debt. I didn't understand taxation or any of these pieces. So my hope with Your Kids, Their Money was to make a guide, make a resource book, make a fun and interesting read for parents so that they can teach all those pieces of financial literacy that I didn't have growing up so that their kids hopefully could avoid some of those missteps that I took and be, set up for success is basically the hope, is that once your child leaves the home, they feel confident and ready and prepared to manage the money that they'll be handling.
Nice.
It's amazing from that perspective. What you had mentioned early debt itself, what worked for you? What were some of the things that worked for you during that time?
To pay off my debt?
Yes.
So once I was out of school, I moved back in with my parents so that, I could just have low cost of living. That was probably one of the biggest things that helped. And then from there, what I did is I went with pay off the smallest debt first, snowball method. But what's funny is I say this often, after I paid off that first credit card, I didn't feel good. I was hoping that after that first credit card was paid off, I would have felt good. But what I did is because I threw every single cent I had at my credit card when it was paid off, I still remember this. I remember being like, oh man, I have to wait till I get paid next week so I can go and buy a slice of pizza. And I was like, there's no way I should have been working all these months, making all this money. True, I'm living at home. Cost of living is low, but I should be saving. So it was around that time when I was introduced, probably while I was paying that first credit card, that I read The Richest Man in Babylon with the concept of pay yourself first. And that's what I implemented for my second credit card debt that I started to pay off. I started to save as I was paying it off. And when I did that, then there was a little bit, once that next credit card was paid off, there was a lot of joy there. And then from there, I started paying off student loans. And, the nest egg was starting to build, the wealth was starting to build, and there was a lot more comfort and security that came with that. So that was probably, when I'm talking about the method, it was, I went with the smallest debt first, yes, but I also started to pay myself first. And I think that combination is what worked best for me. And also bringing my cost of living down to almost, as little as possible. It's just food and hope, and, rent was nothing. So that helped.
Right.
One thing that recently happened with me, our oldest kids are right around the same age. My son was going on a field trip, and he saves pretty well. He gets, family members give him cash, they give him gift cards, they give him this, they give him that. So he had saved up, I don't know, 50, 60, 70 bucks, and was getting ready to go on a field trip. And he came to me and he said, Dad, I need some money. And I said, well, why? He said, well, I'm going on this field trip and I want to bring some money with me. I'm like, dude, you got your own money.
Exactly.
So now I think my wife gave him money anyway, but this isn't a podcast about how to teach your spouse her money. But what are some?
We'll have him back for that.
Yeah, that's a totally different episode, and we probably need to have marriage counselors on for that one. But how do you find teaching? In other words, what works in terms of talking to your kids about money, and what do you find that doesn't work?
So what I like to do, I encourage lots of conversations around money. So that's one thing. Like if we're talking about it, then we're learning about it, and that's great. But the thing that I try to encourage more than just the talking is to give them chances to use their money, whether that be to spend it on a field trip or like my son. He also had a small business over the summer selling baked goods at the local farmers market. So he made quite a bit. And I was like, hey, this is a great chance for you to buy an investment. Let's get you an index fund. Let's see how that goes. Or maybe we'll buy you a stock in Nintendo, see how that goes. So I'm really trying to encourage adults to give their children chances to practice using their money. So your son had an opportunity to save, which is great. But that, again, kind of similar to me, that's just one piece of it. So they need to be encouraged, because what you have there is in a scenario where, a child's like, I want to save it, I don't want to spend it. And that's not necessarily a good, healthy money habit, right? Because then we become almost hoarders with our money. We need to be able to both spend and save and hopefully invest. So giving them that opportunity to then say, you know what, yes, you do have some of your money. I understand that this is whatever. an opportunity for you to go on a field trip. And I don't know what the relationship you have with your child is, but we usually compensate field trips. But if you want to have some spending money, you want to buy some stuff while you're on the field trip, that's on you. Like, you need to spend some of your money. Maybe we go halvesies or whatever, but give them opportunities to use their money, because just any one thing is great, but they need to have the whole thing. So you really have to encourage them to use their money to do all the different pieces. And I even encourage folks to lend money to their kids if possible, because again, borrowing and repaying money, especially in your audience, this is a habit that I feel like I never had. I talk about this often. I went off to university, got, tens of thousands of dollars in loans. I had never paid anyone back anything. Like, I had no history of paying back $5. It's not something I had ever done. So I'm like, let's get our kids borrowing money. If we're doing it in a safe space at home where they can learn, it feels bad when I get money, but I owe money and I have to give that up right away. That's not a bad thing. That's a great thing. Let's get them learning these lessons early. So to answer your question, just trying to give more opportunities for them to practice some of these skills.
Yeah.
See, now, Shawn, I don't feel so bad now, because my youngest, she's always like, man, I want to buy this thing. I'm like, hey, I'll lend you the money itself, but it's okay. You got to pay me back. Now I know I could charge interest. So I'm like, hey, I need, it's an extra $2 if you really want that magazine. So I hear you. It's one of those kind of things. If we want to, it's those habits, right? We want to instill them, and it's in that. And I love the safe space. And I always tell my daughter, it's like, look, it's okay. I'll lend you the money itself, but that just means you won't have, when you get paid or do something else, you won't have that money right away. You have prior commitments that you have to take care of. So I love it. And now I get the permission to charge interest. So, okay, got it. We're good there.
Yeah, I do. And I do the same thing with mine. I'm trying to teach him that if you spend the money on this one thing that you want, that means you may not have it to spend on this other thing that you want. Although I did think of a really good side business, so I could lend my kid money, and then if he doesn't pay me back, I'll hire your daughter to rough him up. You could do it that way. So I do want to talk to you also, Clifton, about teaching kids about money awareness, money management, all that kind of stuff led you to The Richest Man in Babylon, which I've read. It was a while ago. It was, I think, 2-3 years ago that I read it, but I thought it was great. And so I want to make sure I get it right. You helped edit an updated version of Richest Man in Babylon. So, and it's Richest Person in Babylon.
Right. It's one of my favorite books. I've already mentioned it in this conversation, so you know how much it means to me. So a while back, I was reading to my son. We ran out of stuff to read. I was like, hey, I'm talking about financial literacy. I'm going to read to him one of my favorite books. The book wasn't meant for children, but it's PG. I wasn't worried about the content. So I started reading it to him, and within the first page or two, his eyes just glossed over. He didn't know what I was talking about. And I realized quickly, I was like, this, as much as it wasn't written for children, it wasn't written for our time. Like, it's just, right. The language is dated. Every pronoun is he, him. It's like, there's no women unless they're talking about, my wife or my daughter or my sister. Like, it's just all very male heavy, and the language is just hard and complicated. So I said I realized at that time, I talked to my lawyer, and I was like, oh, the copyright's run out. I can revise it. It's fine to work on it. So I talked to my son. I was like, do you want to work on this with me? And he's like, yeah. So what I would do is I'd read a line or two to him. And if, again, it got that glassy look in his eyes, I was like, okay, you don't know what I'm saying. How about if I say it like this? Does that make sense to you? And he's like, oh yeah, that makes sense. So I went back and forth with him that way. So he is a co-editor on the project with me, because he was my filter. He was the one who made it clear whether it was something that was plain language. If you've done any reading or writing in the last little while, everyone's talking about plain language, and they, right to about a 5th grade level. And that's right where my son was. So it's not written for a child, but it is written in a language now that I think even someone in grade 5 would be able to understand it. And it's been getting a lot of great reviews, and I'm super excited about it, because again, it's just giving a chance to make this book that it's a classic. It's been in this space for so long, and it's just so, I still think it's wonderful, but I'm hoping that I can bring it forward for another generation to enjoy.
I loved reading the book, and I agree with you. It was a little bit hard to get through. So did you take the stories in the book and just convert them, or did you make new stories that were consistent with the old stories? How did you edit it?
So I wanted to keep it as close to the original as possible. Like, I didn't want to change the stories. It's something I might do in the future, just make a truly updated version. But this is still the original stories, but written with language that's a lot easier to read, with the exception of one chapter. There was one chapter in there that I never liked. So I decided to totally rewrite that chapter. It's my story. It's not one of the original stories. With the exception of one chapter, all the stories are the same, but updated, revised, new characters, cleaner, plainer language, more modern language. So it's still the original story. So if you love the original stories and you're like, hey, I would love to introduce this to my son or my college graduate or my daughter or what have you, it's the same stories and you'll still be able to relate to the concepts and the stories in them, but the language is just so much easier to read, in my opinion.
I want to highlight and give not only you credit, but your son credit. I'm looking at a copy of the book on my other screen now, and it edited by Clifton D. Corbin, co-edited by Caleb K.A. Corbin. So I think that's a really cool project that the two of you could work on together.
Oh, it was fun. It was a fun project to do, and he's still getting a big kick out of having his name on the cover of one of my books. So.
Are you giving him any royalties from the book sales?
Yeah, of course. Well, he doesn't get them. His equivalent of his 529 is getting it right now.
There you go.
Nice.
I would have said he has a room that he's okay and he's hanging out, and you got to remember that. I love it. So you talk about money stories. One of the things that you emphasize as a foundation for personal finances was understanding your money story. So obviously we know like personal finances, we know to save, we know to invest. Can you explain a little bit more? I know you started that, but what that means in regards to understanding your money stories.
Sure. So it's going to be different for everyone. Like one of my foundational money stories is some of those experiences I had with my debt. Like that really shaped how I feel about money and budgeting and all the rest. Some people's money stories might go back even further. And in my book, I even mentioned some of them. Like I have experiences of being a youngster. Me and my sister, we would get like a box of cereal and we would never be able to finish it. There would always be a small, like we had everything we needed. We always did. But my parents, they had less than we did. And it was kind of, we inherited some of that, you need to have a little bit just to be safe, just in case. We inherited their money story into ours, which is why we still, if I go to my sister's house right now, I'm sure I'll find a box of cereal that just has a little bit of left in it that she just can't finish. And it's just those early stories that we incorporate into our lives, whether it be, I need to have something just to be safe, or some of those, those money tropes that we hear too. Money is the root of all evil, which may make you want to spend it all, or all of these things, they play into how we behave with our money, whether we feel like we should have some, whether we shouldn't, whether we should spend, whether we should save. And it's identifying what some of those feelings are, and those stories can help you manage your money a little bit better. If you have a tendency to feel like you need to spend, whether that's, money, like shopping therapy to make yourself feel better, if you recognize that, then you can start to address it. But until you recognize that, it's going to be harder for you to, make the changes in your life to address, let's say, an unhealthy money habit.
Both books are available. I know they're available on Amazon, and people can get them, I think, through your website as well?
Yes, of course. You can go to my website. You can find both books on my website. My first book is available pretty much all over. You can find it on Amazon.com. I've got an audio version, so it's on Audible. You can find the Kindle version at Barnes & Noble, all over. For the most part, the updated version of The Richest Man in Babylon, or The Richest Person in Babylon, is only available on Amazon right now.
And I know you've got a ton of other stuff on your website, guide to talking to your kids about money, what's financial literacy, ultimate guide to giving your child an allowance. We're almost to that age where we're thinking about giving our boys an allowance. What's your take on allowances?
I love allowances. If you remember a moment ago, I was saying one of the things I encourage, if at all possible, is to give children opportunities to practice using money. And allowance is a great means of giving them access to cash to practice using money. We talked about, lending kids money. I wouldn't advise lending anything to a child if they don't have the means of, repaying it, right? So if they don't have cash flow, can't then say, I'm going to lend this money to you. You're pretty much putting them into a debt circumstance where they can't get out of. So I love the allowance because it gives children opportunities to have access to money to start then practicing some of these money habit skills that we're talking about. So I'm very pro allowance. But that said, I recognize not all family budgets allow for an allowance, and not everyone is also pro allowance. So there's other means of finding money in your budget to give your child opportunities to practice. One thing I say is, like, if you can't that, let's say you don't have an allowance, but you're planning to you're planning to feed your child. Why don't you have them manage part of the grocery budget? So they can have, let's say you tell them this week you manage the breakfast budget. So whatever you were planning to spend, cut that by whatever. This is going to be how much we're spending for breakfast. You go to the grocery store, you let them manage it. If they come in under budget, let them keep it. If they don't, then, you guys got to hustle and figure out what to do. Maybe you dip into dinner, into lunch and dinner, but give them opportunities to practice. And this is one way to do it, is by, finding some money in your budget to give it to them to manage, whether that be clothing or toiletries or food or what have you.
Well, if I let my daughter manage the breakfast budget, it'd be a lot of cheese and bread.
Yeah, so it's true.
I end up saving up.
If I let my kids manage the breakfast budget, it's going to be what are those breakfast pastries? The
Hot Pockets,
Pop-Tarts, or
Pop-Tarts,
toaster strudels or something.
Toaster strudels. It'll be toast. If my kids manage the budget, it'll be freezers packed with toaster strudels. That's all it'll be.
I love it.
One of the other things I know you wanted to talk about, one of the other things that's interesting on your website, how ADHD may affect your money. And I know that's something that impacts and affects a lot of kids and even a lot of adults. So I want to talk to you a little bit about ADHD and money.
Sure. So it was after I published my first book, The Your Kids, Their Money. My daughter was diagnosed with ADHD, and I was going back through some of the content, and I was looking at some of the things that she and I were doing together, and I was recognizing that as much as I think my book is, it's great and it works for most people, it was definitely written for, the neurotypical brain. It wasn't meant for an ADHD brain. So I was trying to come up with some more content that was to focus specifically on her. And my hope is that I will eventually be able to do an updated version of my book that will focus just on families who have children who have ADHD. But I was fortunate enough to meet Tamika Howard. She's also been diagnosed with ADHD, and she's a money coach. So she wrote a guest series on my blog, specifically talking about some of the things that she's had to deal with ADHD to manage her money. I'm hoping I was just talking to her, maybe hoping that she and I can collaborate to work on the updated version of my book. But it just requires a little bit of revised thinking. So what comes sometimes easier for us, or for me, I should say for us, but for me as a neurotypical person, may not come as easily for someone who has ADHD. And I've got a couple of suggestions on there. Some of them might seem very obvious, like having some visuals to help manage money. So and this works with both, neurotypical and neurodiverse child with specifically ADHD, but I don't like piggy banks. I think piggy banks are terrible. I don't like the fact that you can't see how much money you have, and accessing the money doesn't work. It's just a terrible form of accounting, if you ask me. Anyone who had to have their money in a bank that had the same restrictions as a piggy bank would change their bank immediately. So use clear jars. It's a simple switch from, a piggy bank to a clear jar, but for someone with ADHD, it gives them a visual representation of how much money they have, because sometimes with someone who has ADHD, it's out of sight, out of mind. They need to have that object in front of them so they can see it. So that's something. Or if you're trying to save a certain amount of money, for me, it might be enough just to say, I'm going to use small amounts here, $10, $20 for a child with ADHD. It might be nice to have one of those, the visual thermometers that you sometimes see for fundraising, something like that. So they can see, again, I am here, I need to get to here. And it's a visual representation of what you're trying to do. Because that's the challenge with money, is that it can be very ethereal. It's not always tangible, especially when we're talking about, how much money you want to save. Like, you can't see how much money you want to save. You can articulate it, but you can't necessarily see it. So if you can come up with a visual representation of how much money you're trying to save, that could help. There's other suggestions such as, reminders and scheduling, and that's better for, let's say, an adult, making payments automatic, trying to remember what you need to do when out of your hands and make it an automatic system. That can also help. So there's a bunch of tips on my site, and I'm got a couple more blog posts that I'm scheduled to come out in the next little while. So I'm hoping to put some more content out there, because I feel there is a gap right now, specifically with ADHD, but just in general. And I don't have all the skill sets to talk about the different neurodiverse folks, but I do feel like there's a gap right now. Usually when we see personal finance comments, it's specifically talking about, neurotypical brains.
It's interesting going through some of that stuff. Even for me, the visual, I didn't realize it until you brought it up. My kids had piggy banks. And I don't believe I'm ADHD. I don't know. I know that neither one of my kids are, but when it switched from a closed piggy bank, they now have their piggy banks now are the first letter of their names, but with like a plexiglass on, the letters hollowed out. There's a plexiglass so you can see what's accumulating, and they're paying more attention to it. So even, I don't know that that's necessarily an ADH thing versus just an awareness thing of being able to see how much you're able to save. And then kind of tying back to the first point we talked about, what we'll do is when we go on vacation, when something big is coming up, we'll empty those letter piggy banks, turn them into cash or gift cards, and say, here it is, kids, it's your money, spend it how you want. But know that if you buy this toy, you can't buy that toy. Or if we're at a theme park and you buy cotton candy, you can't buy this toy that you want. And so I love the concept. And if it works from an ADHD perspective, fantastic. I think it has applications outside of that as well, though.
I totally agree. Even before I started focusing on ADHD, I had already started to rail against piggy banks because I think they're terrible. And and I agree with you. It's from like on all fronts, being able to, as a young person, being able to see what you have. And I ascribe to the 3-jar method of, having something to spend, to save, to give. And if they can see what's in there, then they can have a sense, like that's accounting, right? Like we're talking about accounting where I'm putting money in this place, but I have an account of how much is in there. And then I can make decisions based on that. But if I can't see how much is in there, which is what happens with most piggy banks, then you're blind to what's happening with your money. And that's the last thing we're trying to build good money habits. And one of the, I think, keys for most folks is to be very intentional with what you're doing with your money, being very aware of what's happening with your money, being very aware of what expenses you have to pay with your money. And all of that requires you to know how much money you have and how much money is coming in and what's coming out. And that happens a lot easier from a child's perspective if they can see what they have, as opposed to putting it in this opaque jar where they can't see what's going on in there.
What's really interesting to me is, although what we're talking about is from the perspective of kids and how do I teach my kids, and it applies to all of us. I mean,
it translates, right?
It applies to everybody. So we appreciate you being on the show. Anything that we didn't ask you, anything else you want to talk about?
You know what? The only thing I want to say is, from the perspective of debt and having been someone who was under debt and felt the shame, the anxiety, the depression that came with that, I just wanted to say thank you to both of you. I wish I had folks like you back then, so I could have had, someone else to listen to hopefully figure out how to manage what I was doing. But just in general, thank you for doing what you're doing. And for anyone who is in debt, feeling that crushing weight of it, know that it's a point in time. If you put your mind to it, if you focus on it, if you are very intentional with what you're doing, you can work your way out of it. It doesn't need to be your permanent state of being. You can work your way out of it, but it does take hard work. But, listening to the two of you should help.
Well, George can speak for himself if he wants to, but I would include you in that conversation. So thank you for these books that not only we can use to help our kids understand more about money, but anytime I teach my kid about money, there's always a lesson in there for me as well.
I would agree. I think getting that message out there and people who care, you can tell there's a passion, and that heart of a teacher is needed out there. And I think that's definitely seen here. And I appreciate you and the things that you do. I can't wait to give your book away, it looks like, because it looks like there's going to be some people we can help out there with that information. So thank you for that.
Yeah,
well, thank you.
Absolutely.
I appreciate that.
And I want to give out your contact information again one more time. But if you miss it, if you're listening and you miss it, it'll be in the notes. But everything is Clifton Corbin. So CliftonCorbin.com, hello@CliftonCorbin.com, LinkedIn, Instagram, and Twitter are all CD Corbin. Facebook is Clifton D Corbin. So if you want to connect with Clifton, if you want to check out his books, which I highly recommend that you do, you can find them all there. You can find them on Amazon. But I think that'll pretty much do it. I know we've got a couple of other things to wrap up, but thank you, Clifton. We appreciate you being on the show.
Oh, I appreciate it so much. Thank you both.
So I want to talk real quick about our other sponsors. So our other sponsor is Sam Cohen. He owns a company called Attorneys First Insurance. What they do is they write errors and omissions coverage, basically malpractice insurance, for attorneys and title companies all over the country. Now, I met Sam here in Florida, but he literally writes anywhere in the country. So if you are an attorney or title company, if you know an attorney or title company, a great way to support us would be to refer that person over to Sam at attorneysfirst.com or just attorneysfirst.com for the website. Sam will give you all an apples to apples comparison. What kind of insurance do you have now versus what can he offer? And if he can't give you the best deal, he's not going to hard sell you on doing that. You know, it's funny. I was talking to one of the other soccer dads, and he said there's a new term that the kids are using. And I went, what? He said, well, when you look for something on the internet, what do? I said, well, you search it. He goes, no, that's wrong. I said, what do you mean that's wrong? He said, what the kids are now saying is you search it up. I'm like, whatever. So, if depending on how young you are, search us up on the internet. So you can go, you can find. Boy. You can find their Corbello Financial TikTok. You can find the Yes Nor Law YouTube, or we'd really love it if you check out our Patreon page, which is Patreon/Crushing Debt. Last couple of weeks, we put some content on that Patreon page that you can't get from the free version that you're listening to here on whatever podcast player you're listening to. There's some additional materials. There's some extra stuff that we're starting to fill up the Patreon page that you can get to or continue to listen to our show. We would absolutely love that. I noticed that our downloads are going up anyway. So, George, anything else before we let you get back to your vacation?
Being in New York is a vacation. Let me just say that my budget is being tested mightily here in New York City. So, but no, thank you guys. It was a pleasure. Yes, you're right. I'll go back to living the New York life. So that's going to be fun for sure.
Well, enjoy. I'm actually on my way out to the Gasparilla float, and then I'm on my way to Jacksonville for a soccer tournament. So we'll see how the team does at our soccer tournament here in Jacksonville.
Good luck.
But thanks again to Clifton for being on the show, and definitely his books, Your Kids, Their Money, and The Richest Person in Babylon fit very well with what we try to promote here at the show, which is that we want you to have more money at the end of the month rather than more month at the end of the money. So thank you again, Clifton. Thank you again, George. And we will talk to you in next week's episode of the Crushing Debt podcast.
If you have questions that you think would make a great topic for a future episode, please email Shawn or connect with us on social media. Shawn Yesner and Yesner Law, PL, are Florida licensed attorneys. The information contained in this week's episode is not a substitute for legal advice. Your situation may differ, especially if you are located somewhere other than the state of Florida. If you have questions, please contact our office or contact a local attorney. Thank you for listening to this week's episode of the Crushing Debt Podcast.